in the autumn of 1888. In a stretch of Kansas prairie where the wind never seemed to rest, a 19-year-old girl stood alone at a crossroads with $11 sewn into the hem of her dress and nowhere left to call home. Her name was Adeline Marsh, and 3 weeks earlier her uncle had put her out of the only house she had ever known, calling her a burden he could no longer afford to feed. All she carried was a carpet bag, a mother's sewing kit, and that small folded sum of money that stood between her and starvation. When she wandered into the town of Larkspur Hollow and saw an old windmill standing crooked and forgotten at the edge of a dry creek bed, its blades groaning like something in pain, she did not see ruin. She saw a roof. She paid $6 for it at a tax auction nobody else wanted to attend, while the men in town smirked behind their hats and called it a fool's purchase, a cursed structure best left to rot. They did not know that within its stone foundation slept a secret that would soon silence every one of them, and would change the fate of the whole valley. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Adeline had been born in a soddy 15 miles west of Larkspur Hollow, in a spring when the wildflowers came up so thick her mother said the prairie looked embarrassed to be so plain the rest of the year. Her father, Thomas Marsh, was a wheelwright by trade, a broad-shouldered, quiet man who could coax a straight spoke out of green hickory, and who believed, with the sort of conviction some men reserve for Scripture, that a thing built well would outlast the man who built it. Her mother, Ruth, had come west from Ohio with a satchel of dried herbs and a head full of her grandmother's remedies, and it was from her that Adeline learned to set a bone, brew a fever down, and stitch a wound so fine it barely scarred. The Marsh homestead was not large, and it was not rich, but it was, in the way that mattered most, a child, whole. Adeline grew up with the smell of cedar shavings in her father's shop and the smell of chamomile drying in bundles from her mother's rafters, and she came to believe, without ever being told so directly, that a person's worth was measured not in the size of what they owned, but in the care they put into what they were given. It was her father who first took her, at the age of 8, to see Elias Cobb's Windmill, then newly built and turning proud against a sky so blue it looked painted. Cobb was a Dutch-descended millwright who had come to Larkspur Hollow before the town had a name, and he had raised that windmill not merely to pump water for his own land, but, in a decision the old-timers still spoke with a kind of reverence, to serve the whole community. In the dry years, when creeks shrank to threads and wells went to dust, it was Cobb's windmill that filled the communal trough at the crossroads, that watered the gardens of widows and the stock of struggling farmers alike, freely and without toll. Thomas Marsh had helped him true the tower's timber frame, and the two men had become close in particular way of craftsmen who trust each other's hands, and young Adeline had sat on a fence rail eating a biscuit and watching the great wheel spin, thinking it the most marvelous machine in the world. Cobb had ruffled her hair that day and told her that a windmill was nothing but wind made useful, that the trick of any good life was learning to catch what blew past you and turn it towards something worth keeping. She did not understand him then. She would understand him fully only many years later, standing inside that same tower with dust in her hair and her whole future trembling in her hands. Cobb, however, vanished from Larkspur Hollow when Adeline was still a small girl, in circumstances the town never spoke of plainly. Some said he had simply grown old and gone east to live with a niece. Others, in lower voices, said he had crossed a man he should not have crossed, and that the windmill had stood empty and untended ever since, its water trough dry, its once generous gift of the town quietly forgotten, its wheel locked and its ladder rotted, until people began calling it cursed rather than admit they missed what it once gave them. Adeline's father spoke of Cobb rarely, and always with strange, careful sorrow, as though there were a debt in the matter that had never been settled. She did not think much of it as a child. She had her own small, contented world of chores and lessons, and particular safety of being loved by two people who paid careful attention to her, and she assumed, as children do, that this safety was simply the shape of the world and would not change. It changed the winter she turned 16, when a fever swept through the county and took first her mother and then, 11 days later, her father, leaving Adeline suddenly and completely alone in a house that echoed with their absence. Under the law of the territory, and under the harder law of her uncle's convenience, the homestead passed not to her, but to her father's older brother, Jasper Marsh, a man Adeline had met perhaps a dozen times in her life, and liked on none of those occasions. Jasper arrived within a month with his wife and their 3 children, moved into the house Thomas Marsh had built board by board, and allowed Adeline to stay on as something between a niece and an unpaid servant, sleeping in the loft above the kitchen, and rising before dawn to milk cows that were, in every way that mattered to her aching heart, no longer hers. For 3 years Adeline endured this arrangement with the patient, tight-jawed dignity her mother had modeled for her, telling herself that grief made people unkind, and that kinship would eventually soften her uncle's manner. It did not. Jasper Marsh was a man perpetually behind on his debts, quick to blame his misfortunes on weather, on markets, on the daughter of a brother he had always resented for being better loved. And as the years passed and his own children grew old enough to do the chores Adeline had been doing, he began to speak more and more of her as an expense rather than a relation. The fall Adeline turned 19 brought a drought so severe that even the deep wells ran shallow, and Jasper, staring at his thinning herd and his mounting debts to the bank in town, decided the matter plainly one evening at supper. He told her the farm could not feed another mouth that did not work land it would never inherit, and he gave her 3 days to find somewhere else to be. Adeline did not argue. She had learned, in 3 years under his roof, that arguing with Jasper Marsh only sharpened his cruelty, and so she packed her mother's sewing kit and her father's small folding knife, and on the morning of the 4th day she walked the 15 miles into Larkspur Hollow with $11, every cent she had managed to save from mending clothes for neighbor women who paid her quietly and without her uncle's knowledge, sewn into the hem of her dress, where his temper could not reach it. Larkspur Hollow in that autumn of 1888 was a town holding its breath. The drought that had emptied Jasper Marsh's wells had done the same to half the farms in the county, and the man who held most of the paper on those farms, a banker and grain merchant named Silas Vance, walked its single dusty street with the particular ease of a man who profits when other men suffer. Vance had come to Larkspur Hollow some years after Elias Cobb's disappearance, buying up land cheap from families the drought had broken, and had built, on the strength of those acquisitions, a grain elevator, a mercantile, and a controlling interest in the new steam-powered water pump that had replaced Cobb's old Windmill as the town's official source of water, a pump for which Vance now charged a toll that struck Adeline, when she first heard the price, as obscene given how freely the old. Windmill had once given the same water away. It was on her 2nd day in town, sleeping in the loft of a livery stable in exchange for mucking stalls, that Adeline heard the auctioneer's bell and wandered toward the courthouse steps to find a small, unenthusiastic crowd gathered to watch the county sell off a handful of properties seized for unpaid taxes. Among them, listed almost as an afterthought, was a parcel described only as Windmill and Outbuilding, disused Cobb's Crossing, and when Adeline heard that name a strange warmth moved through her chest, some current of memory reaching back to a fence rail and a biscuit and a great will turning against the blue sky. The bidding, when it came, was brief and derisive. A few men chuckled and shook their heads. Someone muttered that the place was cursed and not worth the taxes owed on it, and when the auctioneer, more out of procedure than hope, asked if anyone would offer even a token bid, Adeline heard her own voice before she had fully decided to speak, offering $6, every coin of it real, for the Windmill and its small stone outbuilding at Cobb's Crossing. The auctioneer, startled, accepted before anyone could laugh her out of it, and just like that, at 19 years old, orphaned, evicted, and alone, Adeline Marsh became the owner of crooked, cursed, forgotten Windmill that the whole town agreed was worth nothing at all. She walked the 2 miles out to Cobb's Crossing that same afternoon with the last of her $11 now down to $5, and stood beneath the tower for a long moment before she found the courage to go inside. The Windmill was larger up close than memory had made it, its great blades locked and silent, its wooden tower silver with age and hung with the kind of silence that settles over a place people had decided to fear rather than understand. The outbuilding beside it, a small stone structure that had once served as Cobb's workshop and living quarters, had a door swollen shut with disuse, and it took Adeline the better part of an hour, working with her father's folding knife and the flat of a stone, to force it open. Inside she found what 19 years of neglect leaves behind. Dust thick as felt a rusted stove, a narrow cot with its ticking long since eaten by mice, and cobwebs strung between rafters like something trying to hold the ceiling up out of pity. But she also found, tucked beneath a floorboard that gave slightly under her boot heel in a way the others did not, her first clue that this crooked Windmill held more than the town had ever guessed, a small tin box, rusted at its seams, containing not money but a single folded letter in a careful old-fashioned hand, addressed to no one, signed only with the initial E, speaking in guarded language of a promise made to the families of Larkspur Hollow and a debt still owed. Adeline read it twice by the fading light through the doorway, understanding perhaps a third of what it meant, but understanding entirely that Elias Cobb had left this place with something unfinished. She spent that first night in the outbuilding with the door propped and a fire small enough not to draw attention, and in the days that followed she did what she had always known how to do, which was to work with her hands until a broken thing became a useful one again. She swept, she scrubbed, she patched the roof with scavenged shingle, and she traded mending work in town for nails and tallow and an occasional loaf of bread, telling curious neighbors only that she meant to make the old place livable, nothing more. It was on the 5th day, while running her palm along the stone foundation of the outbuilding searching for a cold draft she meant to seal, that she noticed one section of interior wall sounded different beneath her knuckles and the stone around it, a hollow note where the rest rang solid. And it was that small, patient discovery, the kind her father had trained into her, without either of them knowing it would matter so much, that led her to the loose stone, and behind the loose stone to the sealed cavity, and inside the cavity to the true weight of what Elias Cobb had left behind. It took her the better part of night, working by candlelight with trembling hands, to fully empty that hidden space, and what she found there silenced her more thoroughly than the Windmill stillness ever had. There was a leather ledger, its pages filled with Cobb's same careful hand, recording contributions large and small from nearly every family in the county across a span of almost 15 years, a fund the old millwright had called, in his own private notation, the Hollow's rainy day, money set aside collectively by settlers who had agreed, in years of plenty, to build a cushion against years of want. There was a canvas sack of gold and silver coin, more wealth than Adeline had ever seen gathered in one place, clearly the physical remainder of that fund, never spent because Cobb had vanished before it could be distributed. And there were letters, a dozen or more, written in a second hand entirely, cold and businesslike, where Cobb's was warm, letters that made Adeline's stomach turn cold as she read them by guttering candlelight, for they were signed by Silas Vance, and they detailed, in language careful enough to avoid outright confession, but plain enough for anyone patient enough to read closely, an arrangement in which Vance had paid to have the Windmill's water rights quietly transferred out of communal trust, and into his own name, using a forged transfer document, in the same season that Elias Cobb disappeared from Larkspur Hollow, without ever being seen or heard from again. Adeline sat on the dirt floor of that stone outbuilding until dawn broke pale through the cracked shutters, the ledger open across her knees, understanding now why her father had spoken Cobb's name so rarely and so carefully, understanding that the man who had ruffled her hair as a child and told her a windmill was wind made useful had likely paid for that generosity with his freedom, or worse, and understanding, too, that the drought choking half the farms of the county, the same drought that had emptied her uncle's wells and turned him against her, need never have been so merciless at all. Had this rainy day fund been given to the families it was meant for instead of vanishing into a stone wall alongside its keeper. She understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she was no longer simply a girl trying to survive in a crooked windmill. She was the last living thread connecting Elias Cobb's unfinished promise to the town that had forgotten him, and whatever she did next would decide whether that promise was kept or buried a second time. She did not act rashly. Adeline had learned patience in 3 years under her uncle's roof, and had learned caution from a mother who had taught her that a wound treated too quickly often festers, and so instead of marching into town with the ledger under her arm, she spent the following weeks quietly restoring the windmill itself, greasing its gears, mending its blades plank by plank, and asking careful, unhurried questions of the older residents about Elias Cobb and the rainy day fund they had once contributed to and, long since assumed lost. What she learned confirmed everything the letters implied. Nearly every family she spoke with, when pressed gently enough, remembered contributing coin to Cobb in years when their harvest had been good, trusting his word that it would be kept safe against leaner seasons, and nearly every one of them had, at some point in the years since, taken a loan from Silas Vance's bank at punishing interest to survive a drought or a bad winter, never once suspecting that the very money meant to spare them that debt had been sitting, untouched, inside the walls of the windmill Vance himself had let the town believe was cursed and worthless. It did not take long for Silas Vance to notice that the crooked windmill at Cobb's Crossing was crooked no longer. He rode out to Cobb's Crossing himself one gray afternoon in November, dressed in the fine dark coat that marked him as a man of consequence in a town where most men wore patch flannel, and found Adeline atop the newly greased tower, fitting a repaired blade into place. And he did not bother with pleasantries. He offered her $20 on the spot for property, a sum so far beyond what the windmill had cost her that a more frightened girl might have taken it gladly and fled with her good fortune. And when Adeline calmly declined, he raised the offer twice more before his patience thinned and his voice, still smooth, took on an edge she recognized from her uncle's worst evenings, the edge of a man unaccustomed to being told no by anyone, let alone an orphaned girl in a borrowed dress. He told her the windmill's water rights belonged to the town's pump company now, that her tower would never be permitted to draw water again regardless of who owned the land beneath it, and he left with a warning wrapped in as tissue around a threat that a girl alone with no family and no standing in Larkspur Hollow would do well to remember how quickly a place could turn against someone it decided it did not need. Adeline understood then that Vance suspected, though he could not yet know for certain, that she had found something in that windmill worth more than the $20 he had offered, and she understood, too, that she now had a choice to make about how to use what she carried. She could take the coin she had found and simply vanish, bypass it somewhere the name Vance meant nothing, and start a life free of debt for the first time since her parents died, and no one who knew her hardship would have blamed her for it. But she thought of the letter signed only with an E, of a promise made and never kept, of every family in the county who had trusted Elias Cobb with their good years, so that their bad years might be survivable, and she thought most of all of her father's quiet insistence that a thing built well should outlast the man who built it. She decided, sitting once more on the dirt floor of that stone outbuilding with the ledger open across her knees, that Cobb's promise was not hers to bury a second time. The conflict that followed was not settled with fists or gunfire, but with a slower, harder currency of proof and public reckoning. And Vance, sensing the ground shifting beneath him though not yet certain how, moved quickly to secure his position. He called in loans across the county that autumn with an urgency that surprised even families accustomed to his hard terms, pressuring farmers already thinned by drought to pay immediately or forfeit land, and among those he pressured hardest, in a stroke of bitter irony that Adeline could not help but notice, was her own Uncle Jasper, whose debts to Vance's bank had grown heavier than it ever admitted at his own supper table. Vance also spread word to the town, subtly at first and then less so, that the girl at Cobb's Crossing was troubled, unstable, perhaps dangerously so, living alone in a cursed place and asking strange questions about a man long vanished, planting doubt, so that if she ever did come forward with wild claims about forged deeds and hidden fortunes, the town would be primed to dismiss her as a grieving orphan grown a little mad with loneliness. It was a shrewd strategy, and for a time it worked well enough that even the storekeeper's wife, once kind Adeline, began to cross the street rather than pass too near her. But Adeline had spent 3 years learning to endure quiet cruelty without breaking, and she had spent her whole life learning her father's patient craft of building a case, plank by plank, until it could bear weight. And so through that hard autumn she gathered more than just Cobb's ledger. She collected, in careful conversations that never once revealed her hand, the memories of a dozen families about coin given and never returned. She found, in the county recorder's dusty back office, the original water rights filing for Cobb's Crossing that predated by for years the forged transfer Vance's letters had described, and she wrote, in her own careful hand modeled after her father's, a full account of what the windmill's walls had held, ready to be read aloud the moment the town could no longer look away. That moment came in December, at a public meeting called ostensibly to discuss the county's response to the drought, a meeting Vance himself had organized in the hope of proposing new loan terms that would tighten his grip on half the farms present. Adeline arrived uninvited, the ledger under one arm and the recorder's document under the other, and when Vance moved to close the floor to further business, she stood and asked, in a voice that shook only slightly, to be heard on a matter concerning every family present. What followed silenced the room more completely than any windmill stillness ever could. She read Cobb's ledger entries aloud, family by family, naming contributions some of the very people in that hall had forgotten they'd made. She read the forged transfer alongside the true original filing, and she laid before them, in plain and unhurried language, the shape of what Silas Vance had built his fortune upon while the town called an old man's kindness a curse. Vance protested, then threatened, then, when a recorder himself, a cautious man named Abel Pruitt, who had quietly verified Adeline's documents days earlier, confirmed the filing's authenticity before the assembled crowd. Vance simply went pale and silent in the way of a man watching a debt he had thought forever avoided finally come due. The justice that followed was quiet, as justice in a small prairie town often is, built not of dramatic punishment, but of consequence, settling naturally into place. The county voided the forged transfer and restored the Windmill's water rights to communal trust as Cobb had originally intended. Vance's bank came under investigation by territorial authorities at Wood. Over the following year, strip him of his mercantile and his elevator and much of the land he had acquired through drought-year foreclosures, and Vance himself left Larkspur Hollow before the spring thaw, never to be seen there again, a departure the town noted with more relief than regret. Adeline, for her part, did not keep the recovered fortune for herself. She distributed the coin from Cobb's rainy day fund exactly as the ledger had recorded it was owed, family by family, forgiving where families had since passed, and their share could find no living heir, and she used what remained, along with her own restored windmill, to rebuild Cobb's Crossing as a working communal mill once more, grinding grain and pumping water freely for any family who needed it, exactly as it had been before greed, and fear had let the town forget what generosity looked like. Even Jasper Marsh, who had once put his own niece out into a 15-mile walk with $11 sewn into her hem, found himself among the families whose old debt to Vance's bank was quietly settled by the very fund his niece had unearthed. And though he never found a word to properly thank her, the two of them reached, in the seasons that followed, a wary and imperfect peace neither had expected. It is worth remembering now how this story began, with a 19-year-old girl standing at a crossroads with nothing but $11 and a folding knife, casting a foolish, desperate bid on a crooked windmill everyone else had already written off as worthless. The town of Larkspur Hollow had looked at Adeline Marsh in those first weeks and seen only an orphan too proud to beg and too stubborn to disappear quietly. And they had looked at Elias Cobb's windmill and seen only a curse best left to rot at the edge of a dry creek. Both judgments, it turned out, mistook stillness for emptiness, mistook what had been overlooked for what had no value at all. What waited behind that hollow-sounding stone was never merely coin, though the coin mattered enormously to families who had gone hungry believing none existed. What waited there was a promise, sealed away and nearly lost, that a community owes something to its most vulnerable members in the years when they cannot provide for themselves, and that debt, once remembered, does not simply vanish because a man who kept it disappeared. Adeline Marsh, cast out and unwanted, became the one who remembered it for him, and in doing so she gave the whole valley back something far more valuable than gold. The knowledge that what looks broken and forgotten sometimes holds, at its very center, the thing an entire town has been quietly starving without. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline's story and with all of ours here. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need the reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world is willing to admit. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.